It happened in 1989 in one of the most remote and rugged areas of the Siberian taiga. Our geological exploration party was conducting survey work in the south of Yakutia. The Yakutian summer is fleeting, so we worked 12 hours a day to meet the season. Nevertheless, after 2 weeks, fatigue forced the group to take a day off. Everyone spent it in his own way. Some fished in the streams, some did laundry, some played chess, and I took my carbine and went hunting on the slopes of the ridge in the morning. After an hour and a half of my wanderings through the hills, I came to an almost level space covered with densely standing young Darien larches. That's when the meeting took place. I'd already gone deeper into the forest, when in the silence there was a barely audible cracking of a branch just ahead of me, about 30 paces away. I froze and began to cock the bolt of my carbine as quietly as possible. Something, hidden from view behind a canopy of branches, was moving toward me. Judging from the noise, it was a rather large animal, moving through the forest without much caution. It didn't look like a musk deer or a wolverine. I could already hear the creature's breathing. And in a minute, the branches trembled ahead, and it appeared. The first sight of it made the hair on my head stir, and my blood freeze in my veins. And how would you feel if in front of you, in 2 or 3 steps, in the deep forest, from which to the nearest village, 1,000 kilometers, suddenly appeared, embodied in reality, a monster from a horror movie, a creepy ghoul, yellow-skinned with brown corpse stains on his face. But it was not a delusion, not a terrible dream. I saw his bare skull, eyes, hands, clothes, gray jacket and black pants, felt that the creature also warily looked at me. It lasted a few moments. Then it groaned and rushed into the thicket. Recovering from my fear and calling all my common sense to my aid, I began to think, should I pursue to uncover this amazing mystery? Or should I rush back without a backward glance? My feet insisted on the second, and still the geologist's soul prevailed. I followed the trail of the creature that had fled. Of course, now I moved with extreme caution, stopping and listening, keeping my finger on the trigger. About 2 hours later, I saw that the forest ahead of me ended in a vast clearing, situated as if in a huge bowl. 10 or 12 log cabins with flat, grassy, and mossy roofs stood in a chaotic order in the clearing. Some of the buildings looked like barracks, others like ordinary village houses. It was a strange village. Some of the roofs and yards were covered with camouflage nets, and the clearing itself was surrounded by a barbed wire fence. And then I saw the people. They were dressed like the creature I'd met in gray uniforms. One by one, these people slowly came out of the big barracks and with their heads down, wandered sleepily toward the building on the other side of the clearing. Then they stopped at the door, where a man in military uniform, but without epaulets, was waiting for them. On his belt hung a holster. I was distracted from this procession by another group of uniformed men who came out of the barracks and headed toward the hut that stood 20 paces from my observation post. When I looked at them through the binoculars, I was again struck from head to toe by a chilling wave of horror. In front of me was a company of monsters, even more frightening than the one I had encountered in the forest. They were the reanimated creations of monstrous fantasies. I categorically assert that they were not victims of merciless leprosy or physical trauma. The skin of the monsters was of various shades, but all the colors were somehow unnatural, the likes of which are not found on any other people on Earth. Imagine, for example, the shade of a solid, full-body, 5-day-old bruise with yellowing through the pale blue, or pink, as if the creature had been scalded from head to toe with boiling water, or green, as if the monster had not blood in its veins, but chlorophyll. But even more monstrous were their bodies. I repeat, I am sure that their ugliness is not the result of trauma or lepra, gnawing a man alive. There was something else. Judge for yourself. One creature, for example, had 3 fingers on both upper limbs. I suspect that it had the same on its lower limbs. They were so naturally and easily controlled by them. These were obviously not acquired, but congenital deformities. Other creatures had small holes in the tight skull skin instead of ears, and still others had no noses, at least not in our common perception. In place of a nose, the bridge of the nose protruded just a little. And in confirmation of my thought about the congenital nature of the deformities, another group came out of the door of the hut to meet this group. It was quite obvious that I was looking at the offspring. They were much smaller in stature, but their monstrous features and skin color were copies of the adults. It was frightening. The monsters were reproducing themselves. From the door of the third barracks, another group in robes reached out. They moved a little farther away from me, but it wasn't hard to see them. This group surprised me in another way. Surely the people in front of me were human, without any external deformities. Eyes meaningful, normal skin color, but another thing was important. Their arms appeared to be bound with thin, but apparently strong chains, and the guards surrounding the men in robes were numerous. It seems, I thought, that these shackled guys were much more dangerous than the scary vampires standing free and unobserved. As I understood, all of them were taken for some kind of medical examination. First, a doctor without a robe, but in the same military uniform without epaulets, who came out of the hut, gave each monster an injection, took blood from some of them with small syringes, poured the contents into tubes, and then, after a visual inspection, selected 3 monsters, an adult and 2 children, and took them into the hut. Yes, and another very curious observation. The doctor examined each with a dosimeter. That it was a dosimeter, I have no doubt. Geologists constantly work with various devices that determine the level of radioactivity. That's a telling fact, don't you think? What else is there to tell? Around the settlement, I did not notice any clearings, let alone a road. This means that people get here only by air. By the way, the large round area in the center of the village could well serve as a helicopter reception. I wanted to creep closer, but I was spotted, not humans or monsters, just dogs, big black ones. I must have made a careless noise, or maybe the wind changed and pulled me in their direction. Anyway, but the village, which had been amazingly silent until then, I had not heard a single human word during the whole time, only the shuffling of feet, suddenly became loud with furious barking, and the dogs jumped out from behind a distant barrack. Without a moment's hesitation, I jumped out of my ambush and ran away. I remembered the way back well, so there was no need to think about the route. My legs carried me. I had to wade through the dense undergrowth, jumping over streams, piles of boulders and fallen trees, and all this was breathless and draining. There came a moment when I had to stop. I froze, trying to breathe as calmly as possible, though it was hardly working. My heart was pounding like a bell at a frantic pace, seemingly right in my brain. I waited for the dogs. But a far more terrifying ordeal was in store for me. Instead of black shadows among the trees, human figures were looming over me. But these weren't guards. I was being pursued by creatures in gray robes, freed from their chains, and several yellow, purple, and pink monsters. They ran in an organized chain, almost jogging, without making a single sound or looking under their feet. And that was especially frightening. I didn't see any weapons on them, but the intentions of these creatures were fatal to me. It was obvious. The ghastly secret of the village demanded the most drastic measures from its owners. I ran up the slope again, holding my carbine tightly in my hands, clearly realizing that my legs would not save me. I don't know how much time passed, maybe 30 minutes, maybe 3 times as long, but when I stopped again to catch my breath, I didn't hear the chase. Is he gone? Flashed with desperate hope, and suddenly, just 50 paces away, 2 gray figures appeared from the bushes. They were breathing evenly. In the same leisurely jogging pace, the ghastly creatures were heading in my direction. Their faces were still raised, and their eyes, which I had already seen so close to me, looked indifferently through me, and then my nerves failed me, and I fired. The distance was so short that, in spite of my trembling, I did not miss. The first pursuer caught the bullet, froze for a moment, and slowly collapsed face forward. Shreds of bloody rope protruded from the center of his back. I pulled the bolt and shot the second one almost point blank. He was thrown back. Without waiting for the other pursuers to appear, I began to climb up the slope, which had become very steep. When I got about 100 meters up, I looked back. What I saw made me scream in horror. The monsters I had killed were jogging towards the slope I had just climbed. When I saw that the monsters, despite their wounds, were still pursuing me, I fired another shot in their direction and, breaking my fingernails, climbed up the ridge. In this part of the ridge, though steep, it was not so high. So in half an hour, I found myself on its almost flat, treeless summit. Before I began my descent, I looked back. My two pursuers were already close by, but I noticed at once that their movements had become shaky and much slower, and they were weakening before my eyes. A few moments passed, and suddenly one of the monsters stumbled and fell. A few steps later, the second one fell as well. They did not move. After waiting for about 5 minutes, constantly looking around and listening for others, I decided to get closer to them. There was no fear. Apparently, today there was so much of it that my nervous system just turned off, leaving some cold emptiness in my soul. The monsters were lying almost side by side. It was quite obvious that they were dead. It seems that even their monstrous life force, which allowed them to continue chasing me after killing shots, still couldn't defeat the impact of the carbine bullets. With one last glance at the prostrate bodies, I started down the slope. When I saw the campfire, the tents, the guys, it was already dusk. I realized from the eyes of my colleagues that they did not believe my confused story, and even less heeded the demand to urgently call a helicopter for evacuation. Still, it was decided to leave a duty officer on duty for the night. But nothing happened, neither the next day, nor afterwards. We worked in the taiga for 2 more weeks. And then the party returned to Bolshaya Zemlya without any adventures.